This is an RNZ podcast.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
You see Wolverine get hit, or he gets propelled, or someone drops a car on him. At one point, he's in the middle of a nuclear explosion. And every time this happens, he gets up and walks away without a single broken bone.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
But this is Wolverine we're talking about here, right? He's a mutant. He's a superhero. He can carry a bit of weight. And in fact, a number of the stories talk about the fact that his skeleton is really heavy and he stands on things and crushes them.
Welcome to Sci-Fi Sci-Fact. I'm Brian Crump, and this is a podcast where we take science fiction's strangest ideas, weirdest elements, most unfeasible plot drivers, and explore if they could actually happen in real life. Maybe they already have. And in every episode, we bring in a scientist from New Zealand's McDiarmid Institute to explain the theories behind some of fiction's more fantastic flights of fancy, if any theory exists. In this episode, Dr. Chris Bumby, Principal Scientist at Victoria University of Wellington's Robinson Institute and Associate Investigator at the McDiarmid Institute, gives us his scientific take on adamantium, the indestructible metal that makes up the skeleton of the mutant Xmen hero, Wolverine.
Generals, welcome. Today, we're going to witness medical history. Today, we're going to create Weapon X. We're about to begin bonding adamantium to Weapon X's skeleton. Let's begin.
Wolverine is one of these characters that the comic authors seem to come back to time and time again. So there's 50 or 60 years worth of storylines about this character, which aren't all entirely self-consistent. But particularly with the recent films and whatever else, there's some clear storyline around Wolverine, who is this mutant who has this superpower of being able to heal. And because he has this superpower of being able to heal, he gets taken in by the secret government agency who decide to turn him into this super weapon by injecting a material into him which fuses to his bones. And this true adamantium fuses to his bones to form this indestructible metal skeleton, which goes throughout his body and also forms these claws, these retractable claws on his hands, which he's able to push out when he's angry, and he can slash and pierce through any other material, including other steel plate or any other metal or ceramic or whatever else he comes up.
So it's not entirely what's going on in his body as a result of his mutation. It's also to do with a chemical they're able to, or a substance they're able to inject into him.
Certainly some villainous biochemists were able to inject this material into him and take advantage of the fact that he was basically unkillable. And so because he was unkillable, they can put this ridiculous material into him that fuses to form this unbreakable framework. It can't be bent, it can't be fractured, it can't be scratched by any other material. So at various times in the movies and the comics, you see Wolverine get hit, or he gets propelled, or someone drops a car on him. At one point, he's in the middle of a nuclear explosion. And every time this happens, he gets up and walks away without a single broken bone. Adamantium is a word that clearly comes from the root adamant, which means unmovable. And historically, the word adamant has been used to refer to diamond. And you talk about things having an adamantine luster, if they look and shine like diamond. But the challenge with diamond is that although it's really hard, so it's really good at scratching things, it's not actually very tough. And so this is the point where we have to be quite accurate in our use of language. And scientists get a bit pedantic about this, but we get pedantic about it because we want to avoid confusion.
Yeah.
And so specifically here, we have materials that are strong, we have materials that are tough, and we have materials that are hard. And they are not the same thing.
Really?
So a hard material can scratch another material. Diamond's excellent at scratching stuff. Anyone who's got a diamond wedding ring will know you can scratch your glass. You can scratch anything with diamond. We use a diamond scribe in our lab to scratch markings on materials, and there's diamond coated saw blades which are great at cutting through because they scratch and abrade. But if you stick a diamond on an anvil and give it a whack with a hammer, you end up with a shattered diamond. And that's because a diamond is not very tough. And so toughness is a measurement of how much energy your material can absorb before it breaks and cracks and fractures. And so what you want for a tough material is actually a material that can absorb quite a lot of energy, usually by some way of deforming. So that requires that you've got a material that is what we call ductile. So this means it can stretch and deform into a new shape and absorbs a lot of the mechanical energy that was imposed upon it in the first place.
What does strong mean?
So strength is actually the simplest concept of the lot. Strength is just the amount of force, the absolute amount of force you can take, any material can take without breaking. And so breaking means to failure. And so strength, there's a quirk to this in that you can have strength as a compressive strength. Strength, as that means when you're pushing on it. So you can have strength as a tensile strength. So that's when you're pulling on it. And you can have strength as a flexural or bending strength when you bend it. They're not necessarily the same for any material. So a good example of that is concrete. Concrete's great. You can stand on concrete. You can build huge buildings of concrete, and you're not going to crush it. It's really good under compression. But if you pull on a piece of concrete, it's actually quite easy to pull the particles of concrete apart, and it's got very low tensile strength.
Which is why in earthquakes you've got to have steel inside the concrete, or else the skyscraper falls down.
That's exactly why you have to do that. The steel gives the tensile strength and holds the whole thing together.
What then do you think adamantium is? Is it trying to be all three of those things?
Well, that seems to be the basic idea. And in material science, that's actually really hard to do. This business about being hard often comes with exactly what you don't want for a tough material. So a hard material doesn't deform, it scratches, but that means it tends to be brittle. It tends to fail by shattering. If we want a tough material that deforms, well, the problem there is that as it deforms, it can often be a lot weaker, and it's certainly a lot softer. Silly putty is a really good example of this. Silly putty is not a strong or a hard material, right? It's really soft and whatever else. But actually, it's relatively hard to break because it just keeps stretching. So it actually absorbs bucket loads of energy. It's quite tough. And so when we understand what these concepts mean properly, that helps us get them in order and understand what we're looking for. So for adamantium, we're looking for something that is strong and as hard as possible and as tough as possible. So particularly that hard and toughness is a tricky thing to trade off.
Is there anything that gets even remotely close to what Wolverine appears to have coursing through his veins or in his skeleton?
Well, the metals are the place to start, right? So the comic book writers say this is a metal alloy, and whilst they may not be material scientists, they've got that right. It has to be a metal. And there are some relatively hard, strong metals out there. And at this point, I think it's worth just taking a step back into real life and reminding ourselves that actually there are millions and millions and millions of people walking around on the planet today that have bits of metal stuck in their skeleton. Hip replacements, knee replacements, various other orthopedic operations all rely on metal bone implants to hold everybody together. And the dominant material for doing that is actually a really cool material. It's a titanium, aluminium, vanadium alloy, sometimes called Ti-64, and we're going to call it Ti-64 here just because it's quick. And this is has the highest strength to weight ratio of any known metal alloy. So as a first port of call, it's not actually a bad option at all. It's also, as metals go, relatively hard. It's not as hard as diamond. None of the metals are as hard as diamond, but it's a really amazing material. And one of the things I think that's worth noting is that about the point that Marvel Comics was starting to write the Wolverine stories in the 70s, titanium alloy technology was really taking off. And it was taking off because of the Cold War. So both in Russia and the US, there was a big race on around all sorts of technologies related to weapons and missiles and planes and whatever else. And this titanium, aluminium, vanadium alloy in particular was very heavily used in a number of the US Air Force processes and planes. And the US military actually had it as a strategic military important material that they kept a national stockpile of through to the mid-80s, I believe.
However, Chris, you said first port of call, and that suggests to me that there's a catch.
Well, the question always is, can you do better? And so the comics and the movies advertise this material as being indestructible. Right? So indestructible means a number of things. We've talked about the fact that it has to be able to be mechanically strong. It also means that it doesn't corrode. Now, actually, titanium, aluminum, vanadium doesn't corrode. It hangs around in the human body, and it's pretty wet inside the human body, but it's fine. And hip replacements will last a long time. Corrosion is not their problem. The other thing that I think we need to be wary of, if it's indestructible, means that it can survive heating. So one of the things we learn about adamantium is that once it's been set into this original position, it can never be reformed. It doesn't matter how hot you get it, it won't remelt. It's not a recyclable material. So once you've got your adamantium, it's there. And so that's a bit of an issue with some of the metal alloys, in that as you mix more and more metals together, you always bring the melting point down. And so something like titanium, aluminum, vanadium has a melting point about 1300 centigrade. Even if we went to just pure titanium, it's about 1650. Now that's hot.
That's going to kill me, isn't it?
Steel is about 1500 centigrade, and that's about 6 times the temperature of your domestic oven. So it's pretty hot. But for example, when we see Wolverine in the center of the nuclear explosion, I think we can assume that that's a lot hotter still. And so I'm not sure that titanium, aluminum, vanadium would necessarily take that. If we want to go for something that has the highest melting feasibly think of, and is also really strong and doesn't corrode, then actually there's only one port of call amongst the metals, and that is to go to tungsten. Now, tungsten is a pretty awesome metal. It's an element, for starters, by itself. It's element number 74, I think, on the table, which does mean it's quite dense. It's a really heavy metal. So that's one of the reasons why, that and the fact it's quite expensive, it's only used in some fairly specific applications in the world around us. But this is Wolverine we're talking about here, right? He's a mutant. He's a superhero. He can carry a bit of weight. And in fact, a number of the stories talk about the fact that his skeleton is really heavy, and he stands on things and crushes them and falls through floors, and people can't pick him up and stuff.
But his muscle can still handle the weight, even though the floor underneath him can't.
That's right. That's right. So maybe it's a bit heavy isn't a problem. Tungsten, however, in its pure form, is amazingly strong. It's about 3 times the strength of mild steel. It's just about the strongest metal out there. And it's very hard already, so it is a little bit brittle for a metal, but that's not that brittle, really. It will just crack a little bit if you're trying to mill it. If we really want to address that and go for the ultimate solution, then what we can do is we can mix in just a tiny amount of iron and nickel into it, and that just jiggles around in the lattice of the tungsten atoms and toughens them up and gives them a bit more opportunity to deform a little bit under force. And then you end up with a really tough material as well. And so that's called dense alloy, that material. It's about 97% tungsten, 95% tungsten, with just a little bit of iron and nickel in it as well. And you can understand why it's called dense alloy, right? It's a really heavy, dense stuff. It's 2.5 times as heavy as steel. It's half as heavy again as lead. It's really heavy stuff, but it's really strong. It melts at well over 3,000 degrees centigrade. Tungsten's 3,440 degrees centigrade. So that's second only to carbon in the entire periodic table. Nothing else melts higher than that. That's more than half the temperature of the sun, incidentally. So when you make things out of tungsten or dense alloy, you don't melt them and cast them. What you do is you get a powder, and you heat that powder up, and it sinters. So the solid particles join together, and that's what you've got. And they're pretty difficult to machine afterwards. So you try and get this powder into exactly the right shape before you start, and then you consolidate it together, and that's it. You're away.
What do we use it for, Chris, in real life?
The fact it's so heavy is a bit of a challenge. So it tends to be used for quite specialist applications which are stationary. And the most obvious one actually doesn't so much make use of its strength as it makes use of its density. So it's used for radiation shielding in nuclear power stations and also in medical radiation facilities.
Well, that'd be handy for Wolverine if he's standing next to an atomic bomb, isn't it? Wouldn't it?
There you go. Another added advantage. More to the point, everybody else can stand behind him, right? You'll come across tungsten drill bits and whatever else in the hardware shop. Now, that's interesting because they're not actually made of pure tungsten. More often than not, what you find if you look at a drill bit that advertises itself as a tungsten drill bit is that actually it's a tungsten carbide material, which is a ceramic. And what they've done is they've taken this tungsten carbide and they've set it into another metal to make the drill bit, which leads to a possibility for when we're thinking about Wolverine's claws here. So if we've got Wolverine and he's got this dense alloy, almost pure tungsten with a little bit of other stuff in him inside his skeleton, and then he's got these claws that come out, which are already pretty hard, but perhaps over time might blunt a bit if we keep punching them through inch-thick steel plates. What we could do is we could then take those claws and we could just expose them to a bit of carbon, probably in quite a high temperature reaction to do this. That's certainly how we do it in the real world. And we'd form a thin layer of tungsten carbide on the surface of these claws. Now, the thing about hardness is it's a surface property by and large. So all we have to do is change just a few hundred microns, so fractions of a millimeter of the surface layer of this metal, and we can make it even harder than it already is. And we can, in fact, make it into a type of material known as a cermet. And that's what all these tungsten carbide drill bits are. So these cermets are really good at being both tough and hard.
One last question, Chris. How would our clever scientists in the white coats have got this adamantium into Wolverine in the first place? Because surely it would have to have been a liquid to get into him.
That's a very good question. In fact, such a good question, I got asked it by a 10-year-old at dinner time last night. So,
is this where it all falls over, Chris?
No, it's not. No, it's not. So, firstly, we've just agreed that we can't melt tungsten, right? It's already at 3,500 degrees C. There's nothing we can hold it in. Anything we try and put it in will also melt. Secondly, even if we've got Wolverine with superhuman powers and we're pumping something at 3,500 degrees centigrade into him, the moment it gets to the end of our needle or nozzle, it's just going to cool down and set. So it's not going to get anywhere near his bones. So I think we have to say we're not pumping in a molten metal. What we must be doing is pumping in some other sort of material that contains tungsten, in this case, atoms, in some sort of chemical. And we call this a precursor. So for all sorts of chemical reactions and materials reactions, we start with precursor chemicals that contain the material we want to finish up with. And what we then do is we form them into the shape or whatever it is we want, and then we undergo a reaction that gives us the material we want. Now, tungstens are pretty tricky, but in principle, we could think about pumping in chemicals containing tungsten with some other probably organic molecules on the outside to make them liquid. And then we can pump that in and it can find its way to his bones and bond there. And then over time, it can sinter itself together. So that's that at the molecular level. The other way of doing it, which has been demonstrated, so I've never heard of anyone doing that with tungsten generally, and definitely not in someone's body. In fact, I've never heard of anyone trying to fuse metal to anyone's body this way before, and I wouldn't recommend it. But the other way we might consider doing this is if we started with very small nanocrystals of tungsten, and then we can treat those just like big molecules of tungsten, and we can again coat them up in some other bits of molecule to make them dissolve into a solvent, into a liquid that we can inject, probably into water if we're going to put it into somebody else, and then we inject it into their bloodstream, and we rely on those chemicals around the outside of the particle to go looking for bone cells and bond to the bone cells, and then when we've got enough of it in, we can activate it. There's all sorts of ways we could possibly activate that with some sort of external signal, maybe a radio frequency signal or a microwave. Or it's Wolverine. We could probably microwave him. and coat it round his bones.
Chris, it's been fascinating talking with you. I do, at the end of all this, feel rather sorry for Wolverine. I think it's he's got a tough life.
I understand why he's a bit grumpy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci-Fi Sci-Fact, hosted by me, Brian Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci-Fi Sci-Fact on the RNZ Podcasts page. RNZ Podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you might find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.